happens when you let Saudi Arabia into the BRICS, given the other members? You have two of the three largest oil producers in the world, Russia and Saudi Arabia. You have two of the three largest nuclear arsenals in the world, Russia and China. You have, throwing India in, and some others, you have about 50% of global population, 54% of global GDP using purchasing power parity. Well, this is not the old third world. These are not basket cases. These are many of the biggest economies in the world that collectively have enormous power, natural resources, gold reserves, landmass, population, military. And again, I could go down the list, but this is a bloc that is as powerful in its own way by a lot of these metrics as the collective West, which I would call, US, Canada, Western Europe, Japan, Australia, New Zealand.
You might figure out that I am not Adam Taggart. This is Stephanie Bomboy of Macro Mavens, standing in for Adam today, who is out. He probably wouldn't want me to advertise this, but he's celebrating his birthday. And so here I am, and I have the great pleasure of having a conversation with the foremost authority, I would say, on what's happening in terms of the world currency regime, current and future, and that is none other than Jim Rickards. And I'm so excited to be having this conversation with him because there's a lot, as you will learn, that's going to unfold in the coming months that will have major implications for investors all around the globe. So this should be a very interesting and enlightening conversation. Jim, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thanks for inviting me. It's great to be with you.
Oh, it's always a pleasure. I look forward to this because this is where I get to learn a ton of stuff. So I feel like I could just sit in the back seat of the classroom and listen. But this whole topic of the future of the dollar as a reserve currency has really become sort of a focus of attention on the heels of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine and then the sanction of their reserves. And people came to understand that, by weaponizing the dollar in that fashion, that they were kind of pushing the rest of the world to find alternatives, because who knows if they'd have access to those dollars in certain circumstances. And so it's shined a light on a topic that I know you and I have been looking at for much, much longer than the last 15 months. And I think it's important. We don't need to go through the whole history, but to kind of enlighten people about how this is just, the latest installment in a, latest chapter, let's say, in a book that's been, going on for, I would argue, 2 decades now with this de-dollarization that people are talking about, really starting back in around 2000 and gaining particular momentum after the global financial crisis in 2009. And now here we are again, and things are really heating up again. So maybe in sort of very cursory fashion, you can kind of explain to people how much work has gone in to this process of creating a viable alternative to the US dollar over the last 20 years, and what this upcoming BRICS meeting in August means in that context.
Yeah, I'd be glad to do that, Stephanie. And the great thing about your audience is so smart. We don't have to go over every twist and turn of international monetary policy over the last 50 years. We could, but we're not going to do that. I think people know the outline. Yeah, it's really what's coming. That's the main event. So a couple of things. We should probably, without taking too much for granted, we should probably just define BRICS. It's an acronym: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. So those are the BRICS. And started in 2002 as a Goldman Sachs marketing gimmick. Jim O'Neill and some partners came up with it. And all they did, I'm not diminishing what they did, but they kind of took the leading economies, took out the G7 and Switzerland and a couple of obvious leaders, and said, well, who's left? That will be the up-and-comers, the fastest growing developing economies. And they got Brazil, Russia, India, and China. That was kind of easy. And then a few years later, they added South Africa, which was a little bit of a favor to South Africa. South Africa is not anywhere near as large as those other economies or as important. However, it is one of the biggest economies in Africa. And if you're going to be the BRICS, you probably, you can't just be South America and Asia. You probably need to include an African country. So they picked South Africa. So that's how it evolved. So, so for a couple of years, it was a Goldman marketing brochure. But then in 2006, at the United Nations General Assembly in New York, annual meeting, and it's famous, heads of state and foreign ministers show up from all over the world, but they have what they call these bilateral meetings on the sidelines. And sometimes there are 3 or 4, say, hey, we're all here, let's just grab a conference room and sit down and talk. Well, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, this was Dmitry Medvedev, who was the president at the time. Of course, Putin is president today. Hu Jintao, before Xi Jinping, and the prime minister of Brazil, actually was Lula da Silva at the end. He got arrested later, went to jail, got out, now he's back. And the prime minister of India. So they sat down and they said, we actually have a lot in common, a lot to talk about. And we added it up. We're a pretty powerful group. So they formalized it. And then in 2009, they had a summit conference, a formal summit conference with an agenda and all that in Yekaterinburg in Russia, in the Russian Federation. And for those who know their Russian history, that's the place where the Bolsheviks killed the Tsar and his ministers and the Romanov family. But I guess the Russians have a little bit of a sense of humor. But anyway, that's where they had this summit, and they solidified, okay, we're a group, we're going to work together, and they did. And over the coming years, they multiplied numerous subgroups. That people say it's the BRICS meeting coming up August 22nd. Well, yeah, that's the leaders summit. They have about 190 meetings a year. They have working groups on women's rights, sports, the environment, climate change. It could go on and on. It's a very active, what they call secretariat, which is central organization. A few years later, in 2014. They formed what they call the New Development Bank, NDB. Well, what's the New Development Bank? They, first of all, it's got 100 billion of capital, part paid in, part callable, but it also has borrowing power with that kind of ownership and that kind of capital on the balance sheet. They've got hundreds of billions of dollars of borrowing power. They could easily get a pretty good credit rating. And the purpose is to make loans for development projects to the member countries. And by the way, there are stockholders of the New Development Bank who are not BRICS, but they're kind of in the club. Well, what does that sound like? A multilateral
the World Bank.
Well, it's the World Bank. That's exactly right. They copy the World Bank on their own terms with their own governance. Okay, the following year, they created something called the Contingent Reserve Arrangement. Well, what's that? Again, they threw in a couple $100 billion from the members. China was the biggest contributor. Again, with borrowing power. So take a couple $100 billion times 5 or 10. That's your power. And this institution was designed to be a swing lender to members who were running trade deficits or facing a run on their currency or facing the prospect of having to close the capital account. Exactly what we saw in 1997, 98, by the way. I was there for that one. We ended up with long-term capital. But, a pool that is a swing lender to countries with balance of payments deficit. What does that sound like? That's the IMF. That's the IMF. So basically, they copy the World Bank. They copied the IMF. And I want to make 2 points. Number one, it's not like the BRICS popped up 6 months ago and said, hey, we're going to have a new currency. It's like Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland putting on a play. This has been in the works for 17 years. And it's typical Russian, Chinese. They kind of run a show, very methodical. So they duplicated the World Bank. They duplicated the IMF. Now they have applicants for membership, and there are, I think, 21 or more countries who have applied. Well, 7 have formally applied for membership. They filled out their college essay and they want to be members. And then another 13 or 14 on the waiting list, so to speak, and will perhaps eventually become members. But when you add those in, some of these will be admitted in August 22nd. That's the next big meeting, starting with Saudi Arabia. Okay, so what happens when you let Saudi Arabia into the BRICS, given the other members? You have 2 of the 3 largest oil producers in the world, Russia and Saudi Arabia. You have two of the three largest nuclear arsenals in the world, Russia and China. You have, throwing India in, and some others, you have about 50% of global population, 54% of global